The dense fog swallowed the searchers as they moved through the forest, their voices muffled by the thick, damp air. The sun had not yet fully risen, and a pale grey light barely penetrated the treetops. Harrow's Peak was always shrouded in mist, but today the fog seemed different, heavier, almost alive. Figures with lanterns flitted between the trees, calling out a single name: Eli. Their voices sounded thin, fragile, as if the forest itself absorbed the sound. It had been 7 days since Eli Harper, an 8-year-old boy, had disappeared. The town was on edge, though few dared to voice their worst fears aloud. The hollowing was a whispered legend in Harrow's Peak, but with each passing autumn, it felt more real. Too real. The search party pressed on, splitting off into smaller groups, their footsteps crunching over the undergrowth. Sheriff Tom Harlan, a grizzled man who had lived through more than his fair share of strange disappearances, led the way with grim determination. His lantern cast an eerie glow, barely cutting through the thick fog. "Sheriff, over here." A shout from deeper within the woods froze the group. They turned toward the sound, hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Sheriff Harlan was the first to reach the source of the voice. In a small clearing, standing unnaturally still, was Eli. The boy's eyes were wide, his face pale as death. He clutched a small, smooth object in his hand, something the sheriff couldn't quite make out. Around him, the fog seemed to swirl, as if drawn to his body. "Eli," Harlan breathed, stepping closer. Eli didn't respond. His lips moved, but no sound came out, just a faint, garbled whisper. The sheriff reached out, gently placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. In that instant, Eli's head snapped up, his eyes locking with Harlan's. The whispering stopped, replaced by a shrill, gut-wrenching scream. "They're coming for you next." Eli collapsed into unconsciousness, the smooth stone figure slipping from his hand and hitting the ground with a soft thud. It was faceless, cold to the touch, and the clearing seemed to grow colder as the searchers stood in horrified silence. The winding road into town had been nearly invisible through the rolling fog that clung to the landscape, and the isolation of the place struck her immediately. The town was surrounded by dense woods, an impenetrable barrier of trees that seemed to press in on all sides. As she drove through the narrow streets, her eyes scanned the Victorian-era houses, their faded exteriors blending into the mist. There were few people outside, and those she did see hurried past, avoiding eye contact. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the fog wasn't just a natural phenomenon but something more sinister. Margaret had come to Harrow's Peak at the request of Eli's family. A child psychologist specializing in trauma, she had handled many difficult cases, but something about this place unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite explain. She had read about the boy's disappearance, 7 days lost in the woods, only to be found alive but changed. Now, she would meet Eli face to face and try to help him recover from whatever horrors he had endured. She parked in front of the sheriff's office, a small, weathered building at the town center. As she stepped out of her car, the fog wrapped around her, dampening her clothes and chilling her skin. She made her way inside, where Sheriff Harlan greeted her with a nod. "Dr. Hale, I presume?" Harlan's voice was gravelly, matching his worn appearance. "Thank you for coming. It's a strange case." Margaret studied his face, noting the lines etched deep from years of stress. "I've read some of the reports. I'll be meeting Eli soon, but I'd like to know more about the town first. Anything unusual you can tell me?" The sheriff hesitated, his eyes shifting away. "Harrow's Peak has traditions. Old ones. You'll hear rumors, but don't pay them much mind. People like to talk." Margaret sensed he was holding something back. "Traditions?" Harlan's lips tightened. "We take care of our own here, Dr. Hale. You'll understand more as you settle in." Before she could ask more, Harlan gestured toward the door. "Your cabin's on the edge of town. Quiet place. You'll have some privacy." Margaret thanked him, but as she left the office and drove to the cabin, the sheriff's cryptic words echoed in her mind. The town felt like it was hiding something deep in the fog, in the woods that loomed on the horizon. And as she stepped out of the car, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of being watched. The Harper family home was a large, creaky farmhouse that sat on the outskirts of town, where the fog seemed thickest. As Margaret approached the house, the wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves scattered across the porch. She knocked on the weathered door, and it opened a moment later to reveal Rebecca Harper, Eli's mother. "Dr. Hale, thank you for coming," Rebecca said, her voice tight with worry. She was a small woman, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Please, come in." The inside of the house was dimly lit, the air heavy with a sense of anxiety. Margaret followed Rebecca into the living room, where an older man sat in a high-backed chair, watching silently. His presence filled the room with an unspoken authority. This must be Elder Samuel Harper, Eli's grandfather. Margaret felt his gaze on her, cold and evaluating. Eli sat by the window, his small frame hunched over as he stared out into the fog. His face was pale, his eyes distant. A sketchbook lay open on his lap, and as Margaret approached, she saw what he had been drawing, figures with no faces, shadowy forms that sent a chill down her spine. "Hello, Eli," Margaret said softly, kneeling beside him. "I'm here to help you. Can you tell me what happened?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, without turning his head, Eli muttered, "The dark. They come in the dark." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Who comes, Eli?" His hand twitched, clutching his pencil tighter. He leaned closer to her, his voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here. They've been waiting." Margaret recoiled slightly, her mind racing. Before she could ask more, Elder Samuel's voice cut through the silence. "That's enough for today." Margaret rose, her eyes lingering on Eli. His warning echoed in her mind, mixing with the oppressive atmosphere of the house. As she left, she couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker than she had anticipated was happening in Harrow's Peak. Determined to learn more about the town's history, Margaret made her way to the Harrow's Peak Library, a dusty, forgotten place filled with old records and neglected books. The librarian, a frail woman with deep-set eyes, barely acknowledged her as she entered. Margaret spent hours combing through the archives, piecing together bits of information. The town had always been shrouded in mystery, but it was the news clippings about the annual disappearances that unnerved her the most. Year after year, children went missing, only to return changed, just like Eli. There were mentions of an ancient legend, of a pact made with something deep in the forest. The words "the hollowing" appeared over and over again, though no explanation was ever given. As Margaret read, a chill crept over her. The librarian approached, her voice low. "Some things are better left alone, Dr. Hale. The hollowing isn't just a story. It's part of the town, part of the woods. You should leave before it finds you." Margaret thanked her and left, but outside, the fog seemed even thicker. As she walked back to her car, she spotted a group of children playing at the edge of the forest. One of them, a small girl, looked up and met Margaret's eyes. She smiled, her voice carrying on the wind. "You're one of them now." The words struck Margaret like a blow, and her unease grew into full-blown dread. Something was terribly wrong in Harrow's Peak. That night, she would sleep fitfully, her dreams haunted by the same faceless figures Eli had drawn, their whispers calling her deeper into the forest. Margaret jolted awake, her heart racing. The dream had felt too real, too vivid. She could still feel the damp earth under her feet, the cold, clammy touch of the fog as it wrapped around her. She had been wandering through the woods, those same woods that seemed to dominate everything in Harrow's Peak. But in her dream, they were alive in a way that felt wrong. The whispers had surrounded her, calling her name with a voice that wasn't quite human. She wiped the cold sweat from her forehead, trying to shake the lingering sensation of eyes watching her. In the dream, she had seen something, someone. A small figure, a child, hiding behind the trees. But their face had been obscured by shadows, and when she had tried to call out, her voice had been swallowed by the mist. The room was eerily silent now. Margaret lay still, listening for any sign of movement, any hint of the unnatural whispers from her dream. She told herself it was just the aftermath of a nightmare, her mind playing tricks on her in the dead of night. But then, a soft tapping sound broke the silence, pulling her back into the present. Tap, tap. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. The fog outside was thick, a swirling grey mass that obscured everything. She squinted, trying to make out any shapes through the mist, but the only movement came from the shifting fog. Steeling herself, Margaret slipped out of bed, her feet cold against the wooden floor. She approached the window cautiously, half expecting something to leap out at her from the shadows. But when she reached it and looked out, there was nothing, just trees looming in the distance, their branches swaying in the gentle wind. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the unnerving silence of the night. The tapping had stopped, but the weight of her dream hung over her, heavy and persistent. She couldn't ignore it. Something was pulling her toward the woods, she could feel it. The next morning, with her thoughts still clouded by the dream and the strange sensations from the night before, Margaret resolved to explore the forest. She had to know what was hiding in those woods, what connection it had to Eli's disappearance and to the hollowing. The Harper house looked even more foreboding in the morning light. The fog clung to the trees that surrounded the property, making it feel isolated from the rest of the town. As Margaret knocked on the door, she couldn't shake the sense of dread that seemed to permeate every corner of Harrow's Peak. Rebecca answered the door, her face still pale and drawn. "Dr. Hale, thank you for coming back," she said, her voice tight. "Eli's upstairs resting, but you're welcome to check on him." Margaret nodded, stepping inside. But her real purpose wasn't Eli, not yet. She needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. Elder Samuel was sitting in his study when Margaret entered, the room thick with the smell of old books and a faint, musty odor. The walls were lined with shelves crammed with trinkets, ancient-looking objects that seemed out of place in a modern home. The light filtering through the window was weak, casting long shadows across the floor. "Dr. Hale," Samuel greeted her without looking up. "I hear you've taken quite an interest in our little town." Margaret sat down, her gaze locked on the elder. "I'm here for Eli, but the more I learn about Harrow's Peak, the more I realize there's a lot being kept from me. You know what I'm talking about, don't you?" Samuel finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, his expression calm but unreadable. "Harrow's Peak is an old town. It has its ways, traditions that outsiders wouldn't understand. Like the hollowing." Margaret pressed, her tone sharp. "People here talk about it like it's a myth, but I've seen the fear in their eyes. What really happens in this town, Elder Samuel?" For a moment, the old man said nothing. His gaze was unwavering, as though he was weighing her words. "The hollowing is not something you need to concern yourself with, Dr. Hale. It is a part of life here. Just as the seasons change, so must certain things in this town." Margaret's frustration grew. Children go missing, and then they come back, changed. And everyone here acts like it's normal. "How can you?" "You misunderstand," Samuel interrupted, his voice low and cold. "The forest doesn't just take. It gives back. But not in the way you expect." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. There was something dark in his words, something he wasn't telling her. "What does that mean?" The elder leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "It means that some things are beyond your understanding. You've only just arrived, Dr. Hale. You don't belong here. The forest, it knows who belongs and who doesn't." Margaret stood abruptly, her mind reeling with questions. But it was clear Samuel wasn't going to give her any more answers. As she left the house, his final words echoed in her mind. "The forest doesn't just take, it gives back, but not in the way you expect." The woods surrounding Harrow's Peak were darker than Margaret had imagined. Towering trees formed a canopy overhead, blocking out much of the daylight. The air felt colder here, the fog thicker as it clung to the ground like a living thing. The deeper she walked, the more the forest seemed to close in around her. She knew she shouldn't be doing this, going into the forest alone, especially after everything she had heard. But something compelled her, something she couldn't explain. It was as if the dream from the night before had been a warning, or maybe an invitation. As she ventured deeper, the faint whispers from her dream returned. At first, they were barely audible, just a soft murmur on the wind. But the further she went, the louder they became, wrapping around her like the fog. The trees themselves seemed to shift, their branches reaching out like twisted hands. Margaret stopped when she saw something in the distance. A clearing. Slowly, she approached, her heart pounding. In the center of the clearing, she found a circle of stone figures, small, faceless children, their features smoothed away by time. They were arranged in a perfect ring, standing as silent sentinels. A sense of dread washed over her as she knelt down to inspect one of the figures. It was cold, smooth, just like the one Eli had clutched in his hand when they found him. What was this place? Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, a child's voice, whispering behind her. "They're waiting for you." Margaret whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. She caught a glimpse of movement, a small figure darting between the trees. Without thinking, she ran after it, her feet barely touching the ground as she chased the fleeting shadow. But the figure disappeared into the fog, leaving Margaret standing alone in the middle of the woods, her chest heaving with panic. She turned in a slow circle, realizing she had lost all sense of direction. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, and the whispers were growing louder. She was lost. Margaret's breath quickened as she stumbled deeper into the forest, trying to find her way back. But the more she moved, the more disoriented she became. The trees seemed to twist and bend, their branches reaching for her like the grasping hands of the dead. And then she found it. A hidden grove, surrounded by ancient trees that formed an almost perfect circle. In the center stood an old stone altar, covered in moss and strange symbols. The air around it pulsed with energy, as if the very ground beneath her feet was alive with dark power. Margaret approached the altar, her hand reaching out to touch the cold stone. The whispers were deafening now, filling her mind with fragments of words, promises, and warnings. This was it, this was where the hollowing happened. But just as her fingers brushed the surface of the altar, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Emerging from the shadows were figures cloaked in dark robes, their faces hidden. At their head was Elder Samuel, his cold eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You've come home, Margaret," Samuel said, his voice steady, as though her presence had been expected. Margaret's pulse raced. "What are you talking about? What is this place?" Samuel stepped forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "You were always meant to be here. This is where it all began, and where it will end." Margaret's world seemed to tilt. She wanted to run, to escape, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The whispers grew louder, and the forest around her seemed to come alive, closing in. Elder Samuel placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice a cold whisper in her ear. "You were always meant to be part of the hollowing, Margaret. You cannot escape your fate." Margaret's vision blurred as the weight of his words sank in. The world around her shifted, the trees swaying unnaturally. She had walked into the heart of something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for her all along. And now, it was time. Margaret woke with a start, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. The room was bathed in dim morning light, the fog outside clinging thickly to the windows like a shroud. Her skin felt clammy, her body drenched in sweat. The whispers, those insistent, ghostly voices, still echoed faintly in her mind, disjointed and haunting. But it wasn't just the whispers. There were images, too. Blurred, fragmented memories of the night before. The forest, the elders, and their faces, shadowed and surreal, lingered in the recesses of her thoughts. Had it been a dream? Or was it something else? She sat up slowly, the sheets falling from her shoulders. Her eyes scanned the room, and as they settled on the far wall, her breath hitched. There, carved into the wooden paneling just above her bed, was a symbol. It was the same symbol she had seen in the forest, the same one etched into the altar. Her mind raced. How had it gotten there? Had she carved it herself in some sleepwalking trance, or had someone or something else done it while she lay helpless in bed? The thought of someone entering her cabin while she slept sent a shiver down her spine. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, her movements shaky as she walked closer to the symbol. Her fingers traced the lines, and for a moment, she felt a strange pull, as if the symbol was calling to her, trying to tell her something. But the moment passed quickly, leaving her with only a mounting sense of unease. As she moved toward the bathroom, she caught her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Her own eyes stared back at her, but something was wrong. For a brief second, she saw herself not as she was now but as a child, a younger version of herself, standing in this very cabin. The whispers, growing louder now, seemed to surround her, filling the room with their eerie presence. Margaret blinked, and the vision was gone. She gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles white, as she struggled to shake off the unsettling experience. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was very wrong, and she needed answers. Determined to find the truth, she quickly dressed, her thoughts racing. Elder Samuel's cryptic words from the night before echoed in her mind, "You were always meant to be here." What had he meant? What did the town know about her past, that she didn't? The time for questions had passed. It was time to confront the man who had been hiding the truth. Margaret stormed into the sheriff's office, the door slamming shut behind her. Sheriff Tom Harlan, seated behind his cluttered desk, looked up from his paperwork, his face hardening the moment he saw her. "We need to talk," Margaret demanded, her voice edged with frustration and fear. Harlan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "I figured you'd come here sooner or later. What is it, Dr. Hale? What have you gotten yourself into now?" "You know exactly what I've gotten into," Margaret snapped, stepping closer to the desk. "The hollowing, the disappearances, the elders. You've known all along, haven't you?" The sheriff's expression darkened, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on her. Margaret slammed her hands on the desk, forcing his attention. "I saw them, Harlan. The elders, in the woods. I heard the whispers. Something is happening in this town, and you're letting it." "Why?" For a moment, Harlan's steely resolve faltered. He looked away, as if weighing his options. Then, with a heavy sigh, he stood, pacing behind the desk. "Harrow's Peak isn't like other places," he said slowly, his voice gruff. "There's something old here. Something powerful. The town made a deal a long time ago, and we've been living with the consequences ever since." "A deal?" Margaret echoed, her brow furrowing. "What kind of deal?" Harlan stopped pacing and turned to face her. "With the forest. With the entity that lives there. Every year, we sacrifice one of our own. A child. The forest takes them, hollows them out, and sends them back to us. In exchange, we're spared. No disease, no famine, no disasters. We've survived when other towns haven't." Margaret stared at him, her heart racing. "But why me? Why was I brought here? Why was I told I was always meant to be here?" Harlan's face paled, and for the first time since Margaret had met him, he looked genuinely afraid. "I don't know everything, but I've heard stories. About a girl, years ago. A child who was taken by the forest but wasn't hollowed. They said she was different, special. That the entity would call her back one day." Margaret's stomach churned. "And you think that's me?" Harlan nodded slowly. "You were never meant to come back, Margaret. The forest doesn't forget." The sheriff's words hit her like a blow. Everything suddenly made sense, the dreams, the whispers, the strange sense of familiarity she felt in Harrow's Peak. She had been here before. She had been taken. And now, the town wanted her back. Without another word, Margaret turned and bolted from the office, her mind reeling. She needed proof, something tangible to confirm the horrifying realization that was slowly taking root in her mind. She needed to find the town records, the truth buried in the past. The town hall was eerily quiet as Margaret descended the narrow staircase leading to the archives. The air was thick with dust and the musty scent of old paper, the shelves lined with records that stretched back decades. As she moved through the dimly lit room, her fingers brushed against the spines of crumbling books, birth certificates, and town registries. She searched with a growing sense of desperation, scanning every name, every record for some sign of herself, some evidence of her connection to Harrow's Peak. But it wasn't until she found a small, leather-bound journal tucked away on a forgotten shelf that the truth began to unfold. The journal belonged to a town doctor, its pages filled with careful, handwritten notes. The entries described the children who had been taken by the forest and returned hollowed, their memories fractured, their souls seemingly missing. But one entry, in particular, stood out. Margaret's heart pounded as she read it. A girl was taken today, but unlike the others, she returned unscathed. Her memories were gone, but she showed no signs of the hollowing. The elders are troubled by this. They say she is different, that the forest has plans for her. I fear what they will do." Her hands trembled as she turned the page. The doctor had written the girl's name at the bottom of the entry. Margaret Hale. A wave of nausea hit her, and she staggered back, the journal falling from her hands. She had been one of the children, taken by the forest. But something had gone wrong. The ritual hadn't been completed. And now, she had been brought back to finish what had been started. Just as the full weight of her realization crashed down on her, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Margaret's blood ran cold as the door creaked open, and Elder Samuel stepped inside, his cold eyes fixed on her. "You've finally remembered, haven't you, Margaret?" His voice was calm, almost comforting, but the threat behind it was unmistakable. "It's time." Margaret didn't speak as Elder Samuel led her through the fog-choked streets of Harrow's Peak. She couldn't. Her mind was spinning, fragments of her childhood memories flashing before her eyes, the dark woods, the whispers, the feeling of something watching her. How could she have forgotten it all? The church loomed ahead, its ivy-covered walls crumbling from years of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mold and rot, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The stained glass windows were cracked, casting fractured patterns of moonlight across the floor. Margaret's gaze was drawn to the altar at the center of the room, its surface covered in strange symbols she recognized from her dreams. The elders stood around it, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. Samuel guided her to the front, his grip firm on her arm. "This is where it all began," Samuel said softly, his voice carrying an almost reverent tone. "You were taken by the forest as a child, but the hollowing was never completed. The entity spared you, knowing you would return when the time was right. And now, that time has come." Margaret shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "I won't do this. I won't be part of your ritual." Samuel's eyes darkened. "You don't have a choice, Margaret. You belong to the hollowing. You always have. You are the final piece, the one who will seal the pact and ensure Harrow's Peak's safety for generations to come." Margaret's legs trembled, the weight of his words crushing her spirit. The fragments of her memories swirled in her mind, the whispers, the faceless figures, the dark woods that had always called to her. She had never escaped. She had always been part of the hollowing. As the elders began to chant, the church seemed to come alive, the walls pulsing with dark energy. The trees outside swayed unnaturally, their branches whispering her name. Margaret felt her will slipping away, the entity's presence overwhelming her. Her fate was sealed. The church loomed around Margaret like a dark sentinel, its crumbling walls bearing the weight of centuries of secrets. The cold air inside pressed against her chest as though it were alive, suffocating. All around her, the elders of Harrow's Peak gathered in a silent circle. Their eyes were fixed on her, watching her every breath, every movement. They stood like shadows, shrouded in their dark robes, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. At the center of the church stood the altar, carved with ancient symbols that pulsed with a strange, dark energy. Margaret felt its pull, as though it were reaching out to her, tugging at the very core of her being. She tried to focus, but her thoughts were a whirlwind, fragments of memories flashing through her mind like fleeting ghosts. Her childhood in Harrow's Peak. The forest. The whispers. Elder Samuel stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "It's time, Margaret. Time for you to remember who you are." The chanting began, low and rhythmic, filling the room with a dreadful cadence. The entity's presence grew stronger, thickening the air with an unnatural pressure. Margaret's legs trembled as she stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the altar. The symbols seemed to glow brighter, and with each pulse, her memories slipped further from her grasp. The whispers weren't warnings. They were reminders. She had been hollowed out as a child, and now the ritual sought to restore what had been taken. Margaret's mind fractured as the floodgates opened. Images of her young self wandering into the forest, the cold air wrapping around her, the faces of the townspeople watching her every step. She had been part of this ritual all along. Her return had been inevitable. Her resistance, pointless. Sheriff Harlan stood nearby, his face expressionless as he watched the ritual unfold. Desperation clawed at Margaret's throat as she turned to him, pleading for help. Please, stop this. But Harlan's voice was cold, final. You were always part of this, Margaret. There's no stopping it now. Just as the chanting reached its crescendo, a shadowy figure began to materialize at the edges of the church. The entity. It was neither fully human nor fully beast, its form shifting, indistinct, yet menacing. The shadows from the trees outside seemed to stretch toward the altar as if the entire forest were awakening, responding to the ritual's call. The entity's presence filled her mind, its voice echoing through her thoughts. Come home, Margaret. Join us. Her body shuddered under its influence, her will slipping further away. Margaret felt herself moving, not of her own volition but driven by the entity's call. She stepped out of the church and into the forest beyond, the trees swaying unnaturally as if bowing to the dark power coursing through them. The fog thickened around her, but she could still hear the whispers, louder now, calling her name. The forest felt alive, pulsing with ancient power, as though it were an extension of the entity itself. Each step she took deeper into the woods drew her closer to the heart of the hollowing, the truth of what had been done to her. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. The voice of the entity enveloped her, no longer just whispers but a tangible force. You've always belonged to me, Margaret. I will restore you to your true form. Embrace your destiny. Margaret's thoughts grew hazy, memories of her life outside Harrow's peak fading like mist in the wind. The pull of the forest was overwhelming. It promised her peace, power, and a return to the hollowed version of herself, a version that would no longer resist, no longer remember. Her old life was slipping away, the faces of people she had once loved now distant blurs. Through the swirling fog, she glimpsed a figure. Eli. The boy she had come to save. He stood silently, watching her from the trees. His eyes, once wide with fear, were now empty, hollowed out, just like hers had been so many years ago. The sight of him chilled her to the core. She was becoming what Eli had become, a vessel, a hollow shell, destined to serve the entity forever. The moment of surrender was close. Margaret could feel herself teetering on the edge, ready to give in. But then, out of nowhere, a memory pierced through the fog. A moment from her past, a flash of joy and freedom, from a time before the hollowing had taken her. It was like a lifeline, yanking her back from the abyss. No. Margaret screamed, her voice cutting through the stillness of the forest. She fought against the entity's control, her mind burning with resistance. The ground beneath her trembled as the forest reacted, the trees groaning and creaking as if in pain. The entity's voice rose in fury. You cannot escape, Margaret. You belong to me. Margaret's legs carried her deeper into the heart of the forest, toward a place she instinctively knew held the key to the ritual. She stumbled into a clearing where the trees formed a perfect circle, the air heavy with an oppressive energy. In the center stood a massive stone altar, ancient and weathered, yet thrumming with dark power. The entity loomed above her now, its shadowy form towering over the clearing. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the voices deafening, tearing at her mind. Margaret's body trembled as the entity forced its will upon her, trying to break her final defenses. Her memories, her identity, all of it was slipping away, replaced by the emptiness of the hollowing. The elders circled the clearing, their chanting rising to match the roar of the forest. They urged her to kneel, to complete the ritual, to take her place as part of the hollowing once more. But Margaret refused. Her body trembled violently as she fought the entity's grip, her thoughts flashing to Eli and the other children who had been taken. They had been victims, just like she had been. But she wouldn't let it happen again. Not to them. Not to herself. Elder Samuel stepped forward, his voice full of conviction. You cannot deny your place, Margaret. The hollowing is in your blood. Summoning the last of her strength, Margaret reached for a stone that lay beside the altar. With a final, desperate surge, she struck the altar with it, the impact reverberating through the clearing like a thunderclap. The entity recoiled, its form flickering as if in pain. The forest howled in response, the trees thrashing wildly as the power of the ritual faltered for the first time in centuries. Margaret saw her chance. Without a second thought, she bolted for the edge of the clearing, her legs burning with the effort. The forest writhed around her, furious at her defiance, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The edge of the forest was close. Margaret could feel it, the boundary between the town of Harrow's Peak and the hollowing ritual. The trees stretched their limbs toward her, trying to pull her back, but she was so close. So close to escaping. Her body ached as if it were being torn apart, her mind caught between who she was and what the hollowing was trying to turn her into. She could still feel the entity's presence inside her, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to reclaim her. Behind her, she could hear the elders' voices, their chants growing louder, calling for the forest to take back what belonged to it. But Margaret pushed forward, her vision blurring as her energy waned. She stumbled, collapsing near the edge of the forest. The fog around her thickened, swirling like a living thing. For a moment, she thought it was over. The entity would claim her, and she would never escape. Then, faintly, she heard Eli's voice. It was soft, broken, but unmistakably human. "You can still save yourself," he whispered. His words echoed in her mind, a small flicker of hope in the darkness. Summoning every last ounce of strength, Margaret forced herself to her feet. She took one final step, her body screaming in protest, but she refused to stop. As she reached the tree line, the entity appeared behind her, its shadow stretching out, trying to drag her back. But with a surge of defiance, Margaret threw herself past the boundary, collapsing onto the road that led back into town. The forest howled in fury, but Margaret felt something strange, an overwhelming sense of cold emptiness settling over her. She had escaped the ritual, but something inside her had been irrevocably changed. Breathing heavily, she looked down at her hands, trembling as they were, and realized that something vital was missing. The hollowing had left its mark on her. Her memories of her former life, the person she had been, were gone, replaced by a hollow ache she could never fully understand. Margaret stood at the edge of the forest, her gaze fixed on the distant trees. She had escaped, but the pull of the forest remained, a constant, gnawing presence in the back of her mind. She knew the hollowing would never truly let her go.